I was fighting to breathe in the ICU when someone decided to pull the plug. The night the lights went OE to the machines flatlined for 3 seconds. That's how this nightmare started. I was lying in a private ICU room, hooked up to monitors after a severe lung infection nearly shut my body down. Just a week earlier, I couldn't breathe without gasping. My lungs felt like they were filled with cement. The doctor said I was lucky I came in when I did. By that night, I was stable but fragile. The steady beep of the heart monitor had become my comfort. Beep, beep, beep. The soft hum of oxygen flowing through the line beside my bed was almost soothing. The quiet rhythm of machines doing what my body couldn't. In the ICU, you learn to measure hope in sounds. As long as the machines were talking, you were still in the fight. The room was dim, lit by soft overhead lights. A nurse had just checked my vitals and told me to rest. My family had gone home for the night, trusting that I was safe in a building designed to keep people alive. And then the lights flickered once. I remember thinking it was just a quick power dip. They flickered twice. Beeping became uneven for half a second, like a skipped heartbeat. Then everything went dark. Not dim, not low power. Dark. The monitor beside me let out a sharp, piercing warning tone before cutting off completely. The oxygen machine made a choking sound and went silent. The air suddenly felt heavy. For 3 terrifying seconds, the only sound in the room was my own shallow breathing. Without the steady flow of oxygen, every breath felt thinner, smaller, harder to pull in. My chest tightened instantly, panic rising faster than the infection ever had. I tried to move, but I was too weak. My hand barely lifted off the bed. Somewhere down the hallway, I heard shouting. Then footsteps. Fast. Urgent. The ICU doors burst open and nurses rushed in with flashlights. The beams cut through the darkness, bouncing off metal equipment and white walls. Someone yelled, "Backup power now." Another voice shouted for respiratory support. One nurse grabbed a manual oxygen bag and began pumping air into my lungs by hand. Another checked my pulse with a flashlight clenched between her teeth. Their movements were controlled, but I could hear the strain in their voices. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it would give out before the machines came back online. In those few seconds, fear becomes something physical. It crawls into your throat. It squeezes your ribs. You start thinking things you're not ready to think. Is this how it ends? Then, just as suddenly as it vanished, emergency lights flickered on dim red strips along the floor. A few seconds later, one monitor rebooted with a sharp electronic chirp. Then another. Beep, beep, beep. The most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. The backup generator kicked in, and the oxygen machine roared back to life. Air flowed steadily again. The nurse's shoulders dropped in relief, but her eyes were still wide. But here's the part no one expected. This wasn't a storm. There was no lightning outside. No thunder shaking the windows. It wasn't a citywide outage either. The houses across the street were still glowing with light. Someone had shut the power off on purpose, and before the night was over, we would find out exactly who. Her name was Corinne. The HOA emergency. The hospital I was in wasn't some massive downtown skyscraper with helicopters landing on the roof. It was a small, specialized medical facility tucked inside a quiet residential neighborhood. From the outside, it looked almost like a large modern home. Clean white walls, trimmed hedges, and a simple blue sign near the entrance. Inside, it was professional, efficient, peaceful, the kind of place families chose because it felt personal and calm, until the HOA president decided it didn't belong there. Her name was Corinne. For months, she had been complaining during neighborhood meetings about the traffic. She claimed ambulances coming in at night were too loud, She said visitors parking along the curb made the street look crowded. She even argued that having a medical facility nearby could lower property values. According to one nurse, Karen once stood outside the building with a clipboard, counting how many cars entered the parking lot in a single afternoon. But the comment that shocked everyone? She said the flashing ambulance lights were disrupting the neighborhood aesthetic. Yes, she actually said that. To her, this wasn't a place where people fought for their lives. It was an eyesore, an inconvenience, a threat to her perfectly manicured street image. Staff members later revealed that she had been pressuring the facility's administration for months. Emails, letters, formal complaints through the HOA board. She demanded they reduce operations, limit nighttime ambulance arrivals, and even suggested they consider relocation to a more appropriate commercial zone. The hospital administrators responded politely but firmly. They were legally zoned, fully licensed, operating within every city regulation. They weren't going anywhere. That's when Karen escalated. On the night the power went out in my ICU room, she didn't just make a complaint. She declared what she called an emergency infrastructure inspection. Using her authority as HOA president, she contacted the association's contracted maintenance company and claimed there was a suspected electrical hazard tied to the medical building. Somehow, whether through confusion, negligence, or blind obedience, the maintenance crew accessed a local, external power junction box that serviced part of the street, including the hospital. Without coordinating with the city, without notifying the power company. Without understanding what that line supported. They shut it down. Just like that. In her mind, it may have felt like taking control, making a statement, proving a point. In reality, it meant cutting electricity to rooms filled with ventilators, monitors, infusion pumps, and life support systems, all because she believed a medical facility didn't fit the community vibe. What she didn't realize was that hospitals prepare for worst-case scenarios. Within seconds of the shutdown, internal alarms triggered. Backup systems were programmed for moments exactly like that. Automatic switches detected the outage and began rerouting power to emergency circuits. The ICU wing had independent backup generators. And as soon as the main supply dropped, alerts were sent, not just inside the building, but to external emergency power contractors. Someone had already called for help before Karen even realized what she'd set in motion, while she likely sat in her perfectly lit living room, believing she had made her point. Technicians were mobilizing. And the quiet residential street she cared so much about was about to become the loudest place in the neighborhood. Because when you interfere with a hospital's power supply, you don't just start a dispute. You trigger a full-scale emergency response. And that response was already on its way. The rumble she didn't expect 5 minutes after the power cut. We heard it. At first, it was faint. A distant vibration beneath the silence that had settled over the ICU. The emergency lights were still glowing red along the floor, and the backup systems inside the building were holding steady. But everyone knew those systems were temporary. Then the sound grew louder. A deep, thunderous rumble rolled down the street like approaching thunder, but the sky outside the window was clear. Through the IQ window, I saw flashing yellow lights reflecting off the houses across the street. The calm, picture-perfect neighborhood suddenly looked like a movie scene. A massive emergency generator truck turned the corner. A small portable unit, not a pickup, truck with a toolbox in the back. This was a full-scale mobile power station mounted on a heavy-duty commercial vehicle. It took up nearly half the street as it backed into position in front of the medical facility. The engine roared as it idled, powerful and unapologetic, Apparently, the hospital had contracts in place for situations exactly like this. When the internal systems detected an external shutdown, automatic alerts went out to an emergency power response team. No hesitation. No waiting for approval. Within minutes of the outage, they were already en route, and now they had arrived. Technicians jumped out wearing reflective vests and hard hats. They moved fast-focused, coordinated, practiced. One of them spoke into a radio, while another unlocked a panel on the side of the truck, revealing thick, industrial-grade power cables coiled like giant black snakes. They began running those cables across the sidewalk, across the grass, across driveways. The once quiet residential street started to look like a midnight construction site. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Porch lights flicked on one by one. Confused faces appeared at windows. And here's the part no one could have predicted. To stabilize the system quickly and ensure uninterrupted power to the ICU wing, the technicians temporarily rerouted the generator through the nearest accessible main service line, the closest direct access point. It ran directly past Karen's house, her perfectly edged lawn trimmed weekly. Flowers aligned with military precision became ground zero for a web of heavy-duty cables and industrial equipment. Thick black power lines stretched across the curb and along the edge of her driveway. Metal stabilizers were set into the grass. Portable floodlights snapped on, bathing her home in harsh white light that erased every shadow. The low growl of the generator engine filled the air, steady and unrelenting. Technicians shouted instructions to each other over the noise. Voltage stable. Load transfer in progress. Keep that line clear. It was loud, bright, impossible to ignore. The very thing Karen claimed to hate disruption had just parked itself in front of her house. Inside the ICU, the lights flickered once more, then surged back to full brightness. Monitors rebooted completely. Machines hummed with full power again. The oxygen flowed steadily, strong and reliable. Outside, the generator continued to roar like a mechanical heartbeat for the entire block. Her quiet neighborhood aesthetic was gone, replaced by flashing hazard lights, industrial cables, and the unmistakable sound of consequences rumbling through the street. And the night was far from over, when reality, by morning, the hospital's legal team had pieced everything together. What felt like chaos in the middle of the night was now a timeline, a paper trail, a chain of decisions. Security footage showed the maintenance truck arriving. At the junction box, maintenance. Logs confirmed the manual shutdown. HOA authorization. Emails revealed who requested the emergency inspection. It was clear this wasn't a storm. It wasn't faulty wiring. It wasn't a random accident. It was deliberate. Hospital administrator didn't waste time. Before sunrise, the regional power company had been notified. By 8 a.m., city officials were involved. By 9 a.m., formal complaints were filed, because once lawyers reviewed the footage, one phrase kept repeating in every conversation: unauthorized tampering with critical medical infrastructure. That's not HOA language. That's legal language, and it carries weight. Around mid-morning, official vehicles began pulling onto the street. White utility trucks, a city inspection van, then a dark sedan with government plates. Men and women in reflective jackets stepped out holding clipboards and tablets. They walked straight to the junction box near the curb right, in front of Karen's house, the same house now surrounded by thick black generator cables and temporary floodlights. Neighbors had gathered on sidewalks, pretending to water plants or check their mail. But everyone was watching, and that's when Karen stepped outside. Witnesses later described the moment perfectly. She came out wearing a silk robe and oversized sunglasses, clearly irritated. Her posture screamed frustration. She pointed toward the generator truck, visibly complaining about the noise, the cables, the disturbance. But then she noticed who she was talking to. 2 city inspectors were standing at the end of her driveway, reviewing printed authorization forms with her name on them. You could almost see the shift in her expression. Confidence. Fading. Voice. Lowering. She walked closer, probably expecting to explain it away as a miscommunication. Maybe she thought it was just a procedural issue, but this wasn't about landscaping rules or parking violations. One inspector calmly asked, "Did you authorize this shutdown?" Another held up a tablet displaying the time-stamped email .silence tampering with a shared power. Junction is serious on its own. Tampering with one that supplies a licensed medical facility? That crosses into criminal territory. Because when you interfere with electricity feeding ventilators, heart monitors, infusion pumps, you're not just making a complaint. You're endangering lives, especially ICU patients. Including me. Hospital records showed that during the outage, manual ventilation had to be initiated in multiple rooms. Backup systems kicked in, but there was still a window of risk. A window where anything could have gone wrong. That fact alone changed everything. The conversation in her driveway went from irritated homeowner to potential defendant in less than 5 minutes. By noon, statements were being taken. By afternoon, the HOA board had called an emergency, closed-door meeting, and the generator was still humming loudly in front of her. House a mechanical reminder of what happens when personal ego overrides public safety. The woman who wanted silence now stood in the middle of flashing hazard lights and official investigations, because reality has a way of arriving unannounced. And when it does, it doesn't whisper. It shows up with paperwork. The street that never FOG the generator stayed 2 full days. Not hours. Not overnight. 40-8 straight hours of low, steady rumbling while the power company secured the damaged junction and permanently transferred the hospital's supply line to a protected grid connection beyond HOA control. Heavy duty cables remained stretched along the curb. Temporary barriers surrounded the equipment. Bright portable floodlights stood tall like metal trees, turning night into artificial daylight. And every single piece of it sat directly in front of Karen's house. During those 2 days, her property had the brightest, loudest view on the entire block. The same lawn she once guarded like a trophy display now had technicians stepping across it with work boots. Utility crews monitored voltage levels from folding tables set up near her driveway. Warning cones lined the street where her guests used to park. The quiet, perfectly curated image of the neighborhood was gone, replaced with reality. Neighbors started asking questions. At first, it was whispers. Why is the generator here? Did the hospital lose power? Was there an accident? But when someone mentioned that the outage wasn't citywide and that it had been manually triggered, those whispers turned into conversations. By the second day, local news vans appeared at the end of the street. Not a swarm, but enough to draw attention. A reporter stood near the sidewalk, explaining that officials were investigating an unauthorized shutdown affecting a medical facility. Cameras captured the generator, captured the cables, and yes, they captured Karen's house. And then the background. The story spread fast. Social media posts popped up in neighborhood groups. Residents who had once supported strict HOA enforcement began questioning leadership decisions. An emergency HOA board meeting was called that same evening. Closed door. No public comments. No friendly reminders about lawn height or mailbox paint. Color. Just damage control. By the end of the week, a brief statement was emailed to residents. Karen had stepped down as HOA president, effective immediately. No detailed explanation. No Apology. Just a leadership transition. Investigations continued quietly after that. City officials reviewed the junction access procedures. The maintenance company reevaluated its authorization protocols. Legal discussions moved behind office doors instead of driveways. And slowly, the generator was removed. The floodlights came down. The cables were rolled up. The street returned to normal, but not really, because some moments leave a mark you can't landscape away. As for me, I recovered. Slowly, steadily, weeks turned into months. Breathing became easier. Strength returned little by little. Eventually, I was discharged, walking out of that same building under my own power. The first time I drove past that neighborhood again, I noticed something different. The hospital had installed permanent, protected power lines untouchable by HOA authority. The junction box had new security locks. The building looked the same, but the street felt quieter in a different way. Humbled. And every time I pass by now, I remember something important. Power isn't about control. It isn't about aesthetics. It isn't about proving who's in charge. Power is about responsibility. Karen tried to shut down a building full of people fighting for their lives. Instead, she lit up her own street with consequences. And that's a lesson that neighborhood will never forget. If this story shocked you, imagine living through it. No one should have to fight for their life while someone else fights over property values. If you believe power should be used to protect people, not control them, hit that like button. And if you want more real, intense stories like this, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Because sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest lessons.